Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance today. Kindly request for all of you to be seated and fill in. To start with, before we begin the ceremony, may I request all of you to stand up for the national anthem. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone, especially our honored guests for the day. We have with us here today His Excellency Irfan Damdov, Ambassador to the Republic of Azerbaijan to Malaysia, our guest speaker for today, Chef Dr. Hellyer from University of Cambridge UK and Carnegie Endowment in the US, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Dr. Shazalina Zainul Abidin, the Director General of Institute Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, Yang Berusaha Mr. Azril Muhammad Amin, Chief Executive Officer of Institute Masa Depan Malaysia, as well as Yang Berbahagia Prof. Dr. Azizan Baharudin, Director of the University Malaya Center for Civilizational Dialogue, as well as Yang Berbahagia Dr. Mahmud American, Advisor to the UMCCD, as well as his wife Yang Berbahagia Datin Nagaya Yusof. Assalamualaikum, ni hao, vanakkam, and a very good morning to all of you. My name is Maya, a research analyst from Institute Masa Depan Malaysia, and I have the honor of being your MC for today's event. Thank you for coming and joining us in today's dialogue, Governing Diversity, Multicultural Societies and Faith, a conversation hosted by the UM Center for Civilizational Dialogue and Institute Masa Depan Malaysia, MASA. Today's conversation coincided with the United Nations observation of the World Interfaith Harmony Week, which was celebrated from the 1st to 7th of February, a celebration to promote harmony between citizens of the world regardless of their faith. It is a celebration of unity in diversity and the divine connection between people and their faith, in which we hope to contribute to as well in today's discourse. Honored guests, multiculturalism is a term used to depict diversity in society. In the context of political philosophy, however, it is a discourse on how to understand and respond to the challenges associated with cultural diversity. It rejects the ideal of the melting pot, or assimilation by members of the minority groups into the dominant culture, but instead endorse the view in which members of this group can maintain their distinctive collective identities and practices. This means not just inculcating tolerance, but also understanding, respect, acceptance towards these differences. And it must be noted, however, that the focus on multiculturalism as a normative ideal tends to be viewed through the lens of the Western liberal democracy. It calls for inclusivity that is based on the Western ideal of moral freedom and human rights, something that is not necessarily compatible with the principles and values of the East as well as Islam. Unlike the Western countries, faith, for example, plays an important role in a society like ours in Malaysia, as the country is a as the country is composed of a diverse mix of religious communities, including Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and traditional Chinese and indigenous beliefs. This has also contributed to the cultural and social fabric of the country, with the religious celebrations and events being an integral part of the nation's calendar. In this current era of extremes, like the recent incident of the Quran burning in Sweden and many more, it is indeed harder to practice moderation in an increasingly polarized world. It is in our hopes that today's dialogue can help our understanding on how to navigate the global multicultural landscape without losing sight of the foundational values of our faith. Now, I'll stop speaking there, and I would like to invite the Chief Executive Officer of Institute Masa Depan Malaysia, Tuan Fazil Amin, to give his welcoming remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. His Excellency Mr. Irfan Davudov, Ambassador Republic of Azerbaijan to Malaysia. Our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Hellyer, University of Cambridge and currently in London. Yang bahagia Dr. Shazlina Zainul Abidin, Director General Institute of Foreign Policy and Foreign Relations. Yang bahagia Profesor Dr. Azizan Bahudin, Director University Malaya Center for International Dialogue, UM. Yang bahagia Dr. Mahmud Berikan, Advisor UM-CCP, and yang bahagia Dr. Munagara Yusuf. First and foremost, my task this morning is to just welcome our guest speaker this morning, but I must take this opportunity to thank our co-host, the Center for International Dialogue, Mr. Malaya, and I also have my friend from Madinah Institute, Mr. Imran. I can see you from there. I hope some of them are here, because Madinah Institute is the organization that is hosting Dr. Hellyer while during his stay here. And I would like to welcome each and every one of you to this special event this morning. I am pleased to welcome those who have been with us for a long time to our several activities, and also to our new friends. I am grateful to Allah SWT that we are able to host Dr. Hellyer today, whom I have known for more than 10 years, I think, since 2008, when you were a senior research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, and he has ever since continued to be a guest at many institutions, notably the cases at the Center for Advanced Studies in Islamic Sciences, and also this morning, I think the topic this morning is very important in the light of the many challenges that we are facing, especially what we read in news and through either social media or the mainstream media. We have, for example, recently heard about the stories of Quran burning. I think that is one of the many incidents that is happening around the world that shows that how important it is for us to sit down, take a seat back, and talk about the issues that are confronting us, especially among followers of different religions. When Madinah Institute approached us to offer to organize one event with Dr. Hisham, without hesitant, I chose University of Malaya, because I know that the Center for Civilization Dialogue has been very active in inviting guest speakers to talk on issues like this. And with this kind of event, I hope that Institute of Malaysia, as one of the active think tanks in Malaysia, we are currently, in fact, we were instrumental in in the formulation of the shared perspective vision and identity, and one of the focus is to promote this kind of activities through dialogue and also different kind of seminars. Without further ado, I would like to pass over to Professor Dr. Azizan, because she will be moderating the session, and I hope that there will be questions from the floor. They shall tell me that he hopes that he wants to also listen to us, the issues and also the questions that we can pose to him. And I hope that the event today will continue to promote healthy dialogue and proponents of the civilization. Thank you very much again to UM and also to Madinah Institute and also to Dr. Hisham for your willingness to address us today. Assalamualaikum.
Right. Thank you, Azrael. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Professor Dr. Azizan Baharudin, who graduated with a Bachelor of Science with Honours in Biology from the University of Tasmania, Australia, as well as a Master of Science at the University College London, UK. She continued on with a Doctor of Philosophy from Lancaster University, UK, in the field of History and Philosophy of Sciences, Science and Islam. Professor's main area are philosophy of science, dialogue between cultures, civilizations, religious people, environmental ethics, bioethics, and the interaction between science and religion. Our distinguished moderator for today also has produced and published more than 200 books, book chapters, monographs, journal articles, and newspaper articles in the fields mentioned above. Most recently, she is the holder of the UKMYSD Sustainability Chair of the Simon W. Foundation and also the Director of the Center of Dialogue Civilizations, as well as an Honorary Fellow at the Masa Institute. She is also a member of the National Council for Islamic Affairs. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Azizan Baharudin and our guest speaker, the Honorable Sheikh Dr. Hellyer, onto the stage for today's event. On to you, Professor.
Terima kasih banyak Mr. Amin for today. Dan kemudian akan alami sudah bersama dan bersama saya pada hari ini kemudian ini ada beberapa negara yang maupun yang beberapa ada Amin CEO beberapa Syekh Hisham Fellow Center for Islamic Studies, University of Indonesia. His Excellency Iban Hibador, Ambassador of the Republic of Azerbaijan, Honorable Dr. Azizan dan Abidin, General Secretary Malaysia, Honorable Dr. Supervisor and also the Chief Officer, Honorable Mr. Imran. Selamat kedatangan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning. Alhamdulillah, we are together with this great dialogue. Some of the thinking that we are all going through at the moment in light of the world is really Islamophobia and such topics. So first of all, on behalf of the UNCCD, we would like to record our great appreciation to the Institute of Certified Malaysia for inviting us to co-host this event, which I'm sure all of us will agree is most critically relevant days just now. So once again, welcome to our dialogue entitled Conversation on Governing Diversity, Multicultural Societies and Faith. So before we begin, it is my special privilege to share and also immense pleasure to briefly introduce you to our audience today. So Sheikh Dr. Hisham here is fellow of the Center for Islamic Studies at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, University of Cambridge. His teachers included Tan Sri Syed Muhammad Habib Alatas and Sheikh Sarah Shanix, Khalifah of the Meccan sage Syed Muhammad bin Alawi Al-Mani. Sheikh Siraj designated Sheikh Sham as the only senior scholar of the renowned Azhar Media Institute and appointed him as Muqaddam of the Tariqah. His previous appointments include being a professional fellow of Cambridge Muslim College by Shah Abdul Quran, an academic committee member of the Taba Foundation by Al-Habib Ali Al-Jifri. Born to an English father and to an Egyptian mother from Abbasi, Sudanese, Pakistani, Moroccan heritage, he is regularly featured in the scholarly section of the annual global list of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world, and was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in London, alongside fellows such as Nelson Mandela and Stephen Hawking, for contributions in these subject areas. He was awarded Ijazah Amma by Al-Sheikh Al-Said Muhammad bin Yahya Al-Inawi of the Madinah Schools. As a British scholar and analyst, Dr. Hellyer has written extensively on the politics of the modern Middle East, North Africa, faith and politics in Europe and internationally, majority-minority relations, as well as the Muslim world relations with the West. So we really look forward to learn your insights and experiences from our dialogue today. So my notes are all over the floor. Don't choose to be on the floor, or the me who has to do that. Okay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as our MC has indicated just now, inshallah, we have 3 rounds of conversation. In round 1, I will pose 2 questions, inshallah, followed by 2 from the audience. So we really like to invite you to grab your hands. In round 2, we will have the same format, and in round 3, I will share what we have shared with us, some advice, views, particularly with regards to the situation in Asia, to say something about how we can do even better. How can we do better in terms of sustaining our rich diversity of cultures and trade traditions in the spirit of peaceful coexistence? So, share, first of all, our dialogue today, we talk about dialogue. Based on your vast knowledge and experience inside and outside of the academic world and world policies, in the thinking of both the Islamic world and the West, would you explain to us how can we govern a multicultural society in the context of faith? I think the word faith is really significant.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. From the outset, my appreciation to Mr. Masa and Malaysia, to Azrael, old friend, and to the professor for a very kind introduction and for agreeing to moderate this morning. And welcome, of course, to His Excellency the Ambassador and the General from Hellyer. I'm really here to engage with all of you. I'm not here to lecture at you or to you. I'm also here to see some friendly faces. We identified a couple of rows already, so how to do that. And to understand more from you also about the challenges that you might face. I suppose many of us hold different hats and work in different areas as well. And as for myself, for this topic, really I approach it as an academic, somebody who's been in academia now for about 20 years. And I have a moment attached to the University of Cambridge, but also within policy, as might have been mentioned. When I was here, so by the way, I used to live maybe 5 months away from where we are. I spent 2 years here, from 2008 to 2010, where indeed I did study with a bit about us, about international life and health, and I was also attached to ISIS Malaysia, and some policy work related to that. And that's really my professional sort of capacity in research institutes and think tanks. And it's been there where I focused on this topic as well as others, including things like security and counterterrorism and things like that. At places like Brookings in the United States, and now currently with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. So I look at this particular topic through that kind of lens. And I also look at it from the perspective of somebody who is himself in a majority and in a minority at the same time. So I'm half English, as was mentioned, so in the UK I'm part of quote-unquote the English majority, in England at least. And I don't get impacted in the same way by anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia, because frankly I have a last name that's Hellyer. This confuses a lot. This confuses a lot of people, including particularly airport officials when I go to airports, because of course my first name is Ishan. My mother was very insistent on that. So it does confuse a lot of people. I'm not a convert, and no Hellyer is not some ancient Arab tribe. I don't believe that for a while. So in that regard, I'm part of a majority, but I'm also from a minority religious community in the UK, as you might have suspected, right? So I have that experience. On my mother's side, developer in Mercy, I'm an Arab, of mixed Arab heritage, Egyptian, Moroccan, and Sudanese heritage. So when I'm in the Arab world, thinking of a place like Egypt, I'm also part of a majority, not so much a minority. So I've lived my whole life really like that. And I'm not complaining. I'm very happy and grateful for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon myself and my family. But it's allowed me, I hope, to have a bit of, let's say, a different perspective about majority-minority relations, which I think is quite pertinent to what you were discussing. And on a professional level, for the last sort of 4 years in particular, we just finished this up, but the European Commission founded a consortium that I helped lead of about 13 institutions worldwide. And they were focused on the governance of religious diversity, secularism, and radicalization. So 13 institutions, and there's about 25 countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia. I tried to learn lessons to give back to the Commission over, I think it was about 3 years. Mashallah, we started right before COVID, and then COVID hit, so we were actually supposed to have a big conference in Malaysia, but we couldn't do that during COVID, so we did a big workshop online and so on. Now, we try to understand how different communities in different countries understood how to engage in those sorts of discussions. There are different types of secularisms. There are different approaches to managing faith and diversity. And it wasn't really our job to say this is better or this is worse, just to say, these are the different models that can be grouped together and exist. So, there were a lot of critiques in some quarters of secularism. And other secularism was actually interpreted and understood as protection for religion from the state. And in other places, it was not appreciated in that way. It was appreciated as more interference into religion by the state, and so on. So there are different types of models. My colleague in the UK, Dr. Madood, is professor of public policy at the University of Bristol. He understands secularism to have soft secularism. There's soft secularism. There's moderate secularism. There's hard secularism. And he finds the quote-unquote the French version in particular. Are there any people from France in the room? I'm going to get in the way yourself. But he understood that to be a very problematic approach because it really intervenes, and is deeply, deeply involved with religion, while at the same time being very, very fixed about what it thinks religion ought to be or not to be involved with. And in other places, religion, I mean, I know there's this perception that the West doesn't really do religion. I don't think that's really true. One of the most, quote-unquote, religiously tinged political arenas in the world is the United States. You see that a lot. And not, I have to say, not always in a very positive fashion. You know, seeing all these evangelical pastors in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, you know, placing their hands over him as though they're gathering the Holy Spirit upon him. It's bizarre, but it's what in Arabic we call majority, or religion merchants. And we saw that as well. You know, I mean, religion can be a very beautiful thing in the public arena. It can be a very ugly thing in the public arena. Because it can be used not for faith or for the drawing of people to a higher purpose, but really just for partisan political power politics. And I'm not sure that that's to the benefit of our politics, nor for religion itself. And we saw these different examples across the world. Okay, so I'm sure all of you are listening to me right now thinking this is all about Malaysia. I'm talking about different models that I've seen around the world. Okay, and perhaps there'll be lessons for you, perhaps there will be. One thing I will say in terms of those models is the most, should I say, sustainable models that we saw, and again, they can differ from place to place, but the most sustainable models that we saw was that when religious leaders got involved in the public arena, that they did so for the entirety of public good, as opposed to pushing one political force over another. In those cases, not only saying, you know, vote for this, but also these guys are bad. Okay. That didn't do well for social cohesion, the examples that we saw. Another aspect of good engagement or good practice was when religious institutions and establishments were arenas for bringing people together, particularly at a time or at times when there was social conflict or friction or tensions in society, that people recognize those institutions as being, quote unquote, I won't say neutral spaces, but open spaces that could bring people together of very, very different sort of points of view. And that was something very positive. Where religious discourse was very clearly about, you know, the quote unquote public good. At least when it was in the public arena. Okay? And I want to be very clear about this point because, in my opinion, the state really shouldn't be trying to control what religious discourse is all about. It should be about ensuring that the public arena is open and accessible for all. And that's where we found the most sustainable models, where religion was respected, that the communities that existed within it who belonged to majority religions were respected, but also where minority communities didn't feel like they were being sort of cast out or something. Otherwise, that's just not a recipe for the best social cohesion that you could imagine. I'm shooting very much in the abstract because I'm trying very hard to think about what will be applicable for all you here. But I really do hope, and I really must, you know, re-emphasize what our professor has said, which is please do ask questions. I'm only here so that I can engage with you, and I will be very, very disappointed if I leave and I find that there were questions that people had, and they didn't want to ask because they felt shy or embarrassed or something like that. I'm not here for any of that. I'm really here to engage with you. I'm very pleased to see all of you here. I know that there was very bad traffic this morning because I got caught in it myself. So you made an effort to get here. I'm really honored and humbled by that. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me. And I hope you will take full advantage of it as I intend to as well.
Thank you so much, Chair. I think that was a great explanation or response to the question. I think all of us have to learn to accept this concept of open space. We need to do talking. I think we have to do away with some of the thinking whereby we feel that we have to have strict deadlines. Very, very clear SOPs. What to do when problems arise. I think we need to move in that direction. And I think you know how difficult this is, but you gave us a kind of a spectrum examples, different models. I think that's a good way of starting the narrative. And also we are in need of fresh narratives in addition to what we already have. So thank you so much. You mentioned there the role of religious leaders. They ought to be seen openly, to be doing public good. I think that's a very good point. So in related to that, I would like to ask a question. In combating religious extremism or extremist thinking and actions related to religion, do you think there is a special or distinct role for interfaith dialogue? Interfaith dialogue among people of faith, among religious leaders, if you like. And what are some of the challenges of interfaith dialogue, do you think? Then after we will
So I'll come to your question, which is an excellent question, and I thank you. I want to mention, just because it might be useful for some of you, the consortium that I mentioned is called Greece. Okay. Unfortunately, like the movie, GREASE, and it's hosted. It was hosted. We just literally finished it a few months ago, but it's the product of maybe 4 years worth of history. That's right, with studies, and it's hosted at the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy. So there might be stuff in there that could be useful indeed about models, and I'm not saying these models even apply or will be applicable to Malaysia. Okay, just that there might be interesting lessons to learn, including what to do. Okay, so that's one aspect. The second is in terms of open space and talking to each other. I remember as an adult visiting the Arab world and hearing certain types of discourses about minority communities in particular parts of the Arab world that the community didn't find particularly problematic, and that I found really horrific. And I found it really horrific because I was already quite sensitized to that kind of discourse, but about my minority community in the UK, right? And these were nice people, okay? These were good people, but they didn't seem to realize that speaking in this way about the other could really hurt the other and was wholly unnecessary. They didn't get it because they always lived in that mindset of being a majority. Okay, so I think that that's just a very important aspect that you try to empathize. It's not to say that everybody's right or everybody's wrong. Okay, it's to say try to understand where they're coming from, even if ultimately you completely and totally disagree. Okay, and that's fine. I'm not a relativist, right? I don't believe that agreement on things that are diametrically opposed. I think this is silly. But it's important to know why people have that point of view, and if only to be able to engage with them better, or to tell them, no, actually, you're wrong, or we don't agree with that, or whatever, okay? There'll be certain types of disagreements where, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, and I think you're wrong, but you could be right. You know, it's what we call in Arabic ikhtilaf. Okay, that's, you know, it's legitimate, right? You know, so we have that in the Islamic tradition very clearly. Okay, where there can be quote unquote multiple right answers on a particular level. Okay, and then there are other things which say, no, actually, I don't think that you have a leg to stand on, but I accept and appreciate that that's what you think. And I don't agree, but that's okay. We can work on things that we agree on. And we don't have to work on things we don't agree on, or whatever, right? But it's good to understand those things, I think. And I think that when that happens, you have far less opportunity for friction and tension. So in terms of, question, and I forgot, I'm so sorry. Interfaith dialogue. So, okay, I'll be very honest with you, I don't do interfaith dialogue. And I'm not saying anything about people who do. Okay, this is not my forte. Okay, so I'm going to be very limited in my response in that regard. I think that anything that brings people together to have discussions is a good thing. I'll be honest, one of the limitations of interfaith dialogue that I think exists is that you very often have people having interfaith dialogue, but they're actually not experts in their own faith traditions. And when they're not experts in their own faith traditions, they, you know, it's fluffy. I'm really sorry to anybody in the room who does this sort of stuff. Again, I don't think it's harmful. I think it's very good for sort of community relations and cohesion, but you know, maybe this is my academic side showing. If I'm going to do quote-unquote interfaith dialogue, I really want to understand the intellectual underpinnings of what we're talking about. And if it's more of an opportunity for us to sort of get together, then I'd like to just explore something else, so that we're just all clear about that. But I don't think that there's anything to be nervous about. And I sometimes find people nervous about this sort of thing, where they don't think it's a good idea. I don't really see it like that. In fact, sometimes it feels like people are insecure. If they're insecure, then that's less to do with the people they're dialoguing with, and more to do with their own ignorance about their own traditions. And because they're ignorant about their own traditions, they feel uncomfortable about going to those spaces. Well, that's fine, and you don't have to go, but then it's not really about the topic of interfaith dialogue. There's more to say about that, but I mean, for this sort of topic, I think that's appropriate.
That was great, because interfaith dialogue is just kind of use concepts and finding out different ways.
But what was important is just one knowledge.
You do, and if you allow me, I think that there are examples of people that do engage effectively in trying to understand, which is great, it's nice, you know, I mean, and it's useful, particularly where you consider that through genuine interfaith dialogue, you build links and, let's say, avenues of communication between different religious leaders, different religious institutions, and those come alive in times of tension and conflict, where they then don't need to start at ground zero. Right, so let's say there's, you know, a riot or something, okay, and there are quote-unquote religious undertones. If the religious leaders of the area have already been in touch because of interfaith dialogue, right, or something like that, then they really know each other, and they really hopefully get along, and they can intervene together and stand together to sort of put things down and to bring calm to the situation. So, you know, I think that this is a good thing.
The line there is the role of religious leaders itself. You may not be engaging in intellectual, theological dialogues, but you certainly have a role in helping guide your followers.
And sometimes people do, not to interrupt, but sometimes people do have genuine intellectual exchanges, but then they have to just be really good at knowing their own tradition and doing an effort to know about it.
Yeah, yes. The literature, but it's also Sincerity, deep sincerity, also humility. You want to do dialogue. Thank you so much. So now it's your turn, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. So I'll take first, who's the other person who would like to ask? Yeah. So, please introduce yourself and so then tell us the question. Please go ahead. Oh, yeah, first row. Row and right.
Prof, just now in your opening remarks, you mentioned about the burning of the Holy Quran, right? And this created a lot of problem now in the world, and I'm really afraid that I'll be going towards Qiyamah because of this. Now, can I listen to the views of Dr. Isham on this issue? What you have heard about this reaction to this burning of the Holy Quran? Because it may continue, and can you imagine the reaction the world will give?
First, you shouldn't be afraid of the Diana at any time. Second, you have no reason to be afraid of people burning the Quran. For two reasons. One, for those of you who know how we dispose of damaged copies of the Mus'haf of the Quran, we burn it. So I remember seeing, this guy in Sweden thinking, who do you think you're hurting here? You're burning the Quran. This is exactly what we do when we have the Quran that is damaged. We will burn it, or we will bury it, or we'll put it in the sea. So you're not hurting anyone, except maybe just your own thick head. It's not much more than that. Of course, he intended to offend, but stupid people are going to be stupid. Okay, that's one. Two. I'm going to be really frank here. I think people really pay far too much attention to this guy, which was exactly what we wanted. So, to give you a bit of context about this, all right, this particular individual is a Dane, okay, who had a Swedish parent. He went to a lot of trouble, but before this stuff, okay, so he was stripped of his ability to practice law because of his being such a controversial figure. And I think the Swedes would have been very happy to keep him out of Sweden, but because he had a Swedish parent or grandparent, he became naturalized in the last few years, so they can't stop him again. Now, Sweden has a far-right political party who apparently paid for his trip to come into Sweden from Denmark and to hold his protest. So there's an agenda going on there, right? There's a far-right political party that's looking to kick up a fuss and looking for a reaction. Where does he do the protest? He does it in front of the Turkish embassy. Why does he do it there as opposed to anywhere else? Because keep in mind, he's by the way done this before. Okay, he's done this several times actually, and in Muslim majority, or I won't say majority, Muslim concentrated areas in Sweden and I believe in Denmark as well. Okay, but because it wasn't in front of the Turkish embassy, probably very few of you even know who did that. Okay, and people didn't react and didn't respond because maybe that's exactly what he wants, looking to cause a fight and looking for reaction. He doesn't fund the Turkish embassy because Turkey and Sweden are bound to be involved in very sensitive negotiations about the accession of Sweden into NATO, which of course Turkey is a member state of and can block or can accept the accession of Sweden and also Finland into NATO. And there are very sensitive negotiations going on. I won't go into that, but there was obviously this desire to make those negotiations even more difficult. Okay. Now it got very awkward because, so as a Brit, we have very strict laws about freedom of expression and about hate speech. And in some cases, one will override the other. Okay, so for example, if I want to hold a protest in the UK that is clearly about inciting bigotry, okay, I won't be allowed to hold that protest. Okay, that's under the law. There'll be restrictions in that regard. Swedish law is different. Swedish law has laws against the incitement of bigotry and racism and so on. It does. But they wait until it happens. Okay? So they are obliged under the law that if somebody comes and says, I'm going to hold a protest tomorrow or next week, and it's going to call, and they know he's going to be inciting violence, they know he's going to be calling for, like, all blacks or gays or whatever to be killed, they are obliged to allow that protest to go forward. They are obliged to provide police protection if it is likely that there would be violence, okay, from like a counter-protest, for example. All of that is constitutionally provided for, and the police are unable to say no. The most the police can do, which I think they should have done in this case, but I don't know how they would have done it, but I think that there should have been some sort of way. They can say, sorry, you can't have it on Saturday because we really have like 5 that day, and we don't have enough police to manage this. They can also say, you can't have it in this particular place for the same reason. So instead of doing it in front of this building, we are going to move you to over there. Okay, so I think that the second thing would have been very good to have done in this case, but it would have been very controversial within Swedish politics because it would have been seen as interfering with freedom of expression. Now, if somebody then does this protest and says something awful and terrible and so on, then they can be arrested at that point, they can be sued at that point, all sorts of things can happen because there is legislation and laws about incitement and all that sort of stuff. But they still have to allow it to take place until it happens, and then, right? I find this approach very bizarre, I do. But again, I'm a Brit, I'm not a Swede, and I think that this was something that it wasn't aimed at Muslims per se, in that the Swedish authorities allowed for it to happen. They had no choice, they had to allow it to happen. I think that they should have been able to find a way to move it, because this was so clearly done in order to create a controversy with absolutely no benefit. But the politicians are not actually allowed to interfere or intervene. It comes down to the police. They're the only ones that are allowed to actually engage in that discussion. Now, of course, there was a lot of confusion about all of this because literally a week later, there was an Egyptian Muslim man in Sweden who said, I'm going to burn the Torah. I'm going to burn the Holy Book of the Jews. And then you saw these news reports afterwards saying, aha, the Israelis intervened and they got the Swedish authorities to cancel it. And the Israeli ambassador in Stockholm took credit for it. It's bunk. He did take credit for it, and he had absolutely no right to take credit for it, because what happened is that the Egyptian himself withdrew the application. The Swedish authorities were not able to stop him. But of course, diplomats being diplomats, particularly from particular places, they want to take credit for things that they can show provides, gives them standing, especially, with their capitals. It's like, oh, we managed to cancel this. It's like, you didn't get to cancel anything, and the Swedish authorities were very clear on that point. So I just want to put that part, to bed, as it were. Now, there's a very serious issue with all of this, and that is that we call this guy an extremist. which brings to mind the idea that he's on the extremes. Okay, so here's the far right extreme, here's the far left extreme, and here's the center and the mainstream, right? That's the image that we get. Well, he is extreme, he's radical, he's a nut. He's not here. He's here. And what I mean by that is that we have seen a mainstreaming of far-right bigotry in many parts of the West for years. And it gets more and more and more and more into the mainstream. So when it comes to this guy, he was brought by a political party that is involved in parliament. As far as I know, they're still in parliament. You have sentiments from, the likes of Donald Trump. Donald Trump wasn't here. He was in the center. He's part of the Republican right. And he was president of the United States. You have people like Viktor Orban, okay, who's the president of Hungary. Okay, again, he's not over here. Now, I still consider all of this to be extreme, but I also want people to recognize and realize that you can have sentiments that are horrific, that are disgraceful, and they're not limited to the fringes of society anymore, but they become part and parcel of mainstream political discourse, which to me is far more dangerous. When they're on the fringes, they might say crazy, stupid things, but they're over there. Okay? What happens when the discourse, even when they stay over there, or when the discourse actually enters the mainstream, this is really dangerous. It really is. And it's partly down to, those in the fringes. It's also partly down to politicians within the mainstream not doing enough to push back against it. And that affects many different societies that are facing this increasing temptation to go quote-unquote radical in terms of those discourses, because again, they're go-getters. Right? So one thing that I remember looking at in terms of the research, people said that Islamophobia increases in Western countries. Can we turn down the AC a little bit? I think people are a bit cold, and I think that would be good. Maybe somebody can address that. Don't turn it off, or maybe that would be good. Oh, yeah. So, oh yes, okay, so thank you very much. That Islamophobia increases when there are terrorist attacks. Now, we looked at the research. Actually, Islamophobia doesn't increase after the terrorist attacks. It increases during election time. Seriously. So, and why? Because it's a go-getter. It's a complete go-getter. Okay, so people will ramp it up during election time because it is the perfect tiger to ride in order to get votes. It's not actually about terrorist acts and stuff like this. I'm sure that doesn't help, but the reality is that these are go-getters, and unfortunately, and that's a problem. If you know that it gets you votes to be openly bigoted and claiming bigotry against the community, then there's something wrong about your mainstream, there's something wrong about your politicians. And I think that's a general lesson that people can take. Inshallah, they have to do this.
Sorry. No, the gentleman at the back. Maybe you can have your questions. Second round.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Azrael from the Masa Institute for organizing this forum. Thank you, Madam Moderator. And it's a great privilege to have Dr. Isham from Cambridge. Before I go to my question, I'd just like to share a little bit of my own experience. I had a privilege of studying in the UK many years ago. Even I've been to Cambridge because my sister studied there. So anyway, I was also a victim of racism when I was there. The English people, the English person thought I was a Pakistani, but I wasn't, so I corrected him, you know. So I had a good laugh later. But anyway, I will try to structure my question in the context of today's discussion, Doctor. Last night I did a bit of research about you, and to be honest with you, I don't even know what sort of questions I wanted to ask, so I just constructed it quickly. I have 5 questions, but I'll try to compress it.
I think you're allowed one.
Oh, I'm only allowed one.
I think you're allowed one.
Alright, then I'll choose.
But I'll be around afterwards and you can do the other 4.
Okay, sure. I'll just ask the one question.
Before.
No, it's very short. It's a very short question. The rise of political Islam. Oh, Nasrin. Oh, sorry, I thought I introduced myself. I'm Nasrin from the Zakaria Foundation.
Okay, thank you so much.
Well, it's a Medal Foundation. Currently, I'm in between jobs, so I have to put something there. So, my question is the rise of political Islam. The context of my question to you is, when I was in the UK, to me the country looked like it was a quite moderate country. But now I notice the global consciousness now is moving towards the far right and extreme nationalism. So in the context of my country, I notice Islam is being politicized to the hill. So how does that square with a multicultural country like Malaysia? Thank you.
This is the question to Purakan.
Maybe have me first and then the question.
Thank you, Prof. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Isham. And thank you, Masa, and UM for organizing this event. It's nice to be back to my alma mater. My name is Zareen. I'm from Musawa. We are a global organization looking at equality and justice in the Muslim family. The question I have to you, Doctor, because the topic is around governing diversity, multicultural societies, and you talk about initially about secular laws. I guess if you could...
Secular laws, secularism.
Secularism. Thank you. The question I have for you is, in your research and your experience, is there a distinction between Muslims governed by secular laws versus Islamic-based or religious-based laws? And whether there is a reconciliation between the two that can actually promote higher tolerance or better management of conflict in the event that there is a shift, because there's always bound to be rifts, right, within a multicultural and multi-diverse society. So, thank you.
Okay, one more and then she will answer.
Please, the gentleman, the lady,
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning. I'm Dr. Alwani from Academy of Islamic Studies, UM. My questions are simple. So Dr. Hisham has talked about the models. Can you please lead me to the reference, the writing that you have done on that? And the second question is regarding your community in the UK. Can you describe how does the society evolve as far as you have observed, in terms of their mentality of looking at diversity? Has there been any change throughout the years? How will they treat the minority? Thank you.
I promise I'm not tweeting or sending messages. I'm taking notes and address appropriately. Also check your phone. Thanks. So the first question with regards to, and by the way, we weren't cutting you off, it's only because we have other people that want to ask questions, and I will be here afterwards and we can talk it somewhere. I confess that I don't like the expression political Islam. I actually severely dislike it. And I understand what you mean, and I'm not criticizing you for it, but to me, when we use that expression, it means that we put Islam into this particular category, and we're saying this is Islam in politics. And I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that it's actually Muslims who are involved in politics, and then they understand or interpret Islam according to whatever. They could be right, they could be wrong. But calling it political Islam, in my opinion, gives a certain authenticity to what they're doing, which I'm not willing to grant. At least not willing to grant just like that. You know, maybe, as I said, they could be right, they could be wrong. And this is the thing about religious-based politics that I think is quite important to keep in mind. It relates to many other questions here. I have no issue with people who are motivated by faith getting involved in political arenas. I have an issue I do have an issue with people who, when they get into political arenas, say, I'm Muslim and you're not, or my way is Islamic and yours isn't. It's like, who provided you with the yardstick in order to insist that this be the case? And people, will come up with all sorts of excuses about this, and I'm not sure that it's particularly useful because they arrogate to themselves the ability to judge how this works. And I just don't think that that's appropriate. I think it becomes very, very easily abused, and it can be, as ugly as takfir, and it can go all the way down. Okay, so I'm not particularly fond of that sort of approach. But again, people are motivated by religion to get into political life. Then I see no issue with that. On the contrary, if they're motivated by good principles, and that's good, let them be involved. Not even that, I mean, that is society. And of course, in some places, you have it as an insistence that people who actually proclaim religious attachment, that they're forbidden from even mentioning it or attributing anything to it in religious life, which to me is another type of restriction that's not entirely useful. So when you say, how does this square with multicultural societies such as your own country in Malaysia, I think it comes down to the people who are actually doing it. As I said, if they're motivated by their religious commitments and they want to proclaim them as such, why not? That's not the issue for me. The issue for me is when they denigrate, if they denigrate. Okay? And I don't see why that would be a foregone conclusion. Okay? You have groups that get involved in society and say, I think that this is right because of my religion and I want to get involved on the basis of these principles. Okay, fine. That's very different than saying, stuff like, we're the kings, we're the sultans, we're the masters of society, and because you don't vote for my party, you're a lesser human being, or you're a lesser Muslim, or a lesser Christian, or whatever it is. Okay, and you have that. I've been in societies, unfortunately, where constitutional amendments will come up for a vote, and they'll say, if you vote yes, then this is for Islam. If you vote no, then you're fighting against Islam. And they're all Muslims. What are you doing? They're all Muslims. Like, I remember this very clearly. This happening. I won't mention where, but I remember this very, very clearly. You're saying that all of these deeply religious people who disagree with you on this policy issue and have perfectly really good rational reasons for it, that they are fighting against Islam. Who made that right? Okay, so I think it's down to the group, the party, or the whatever involved. And people can also change. I mean, there'll be different political parties that they started in one place and they ended up in another place. Okay, so I don't know if that's helpful to you. I know that you were thinking specifically about your own context, and I appreciate I'm here, but I'm, as much as I love Malaysia, I'm not Malaysian. And this will be your society to sort of, I don't like it when people from outside of the community come in and sort of talk at my community. So if you don't know, the intricacies of this, it's not a very good idea. So I don't like when people do that with my own context. So I'll have to come back and stay for a while and get back to you, okay? I should sort that out, please. Anyway, is there a distinction? I confess I didn't really understand your question. I sense that there's a lot of deep intellectual content behind it, but I didn't really understand your question. Is there a distinction between secular-based laws and Islamic laws for Muslims? I don't really, okay, so I obviously misunderstood. What's the question?
So the question was, in terms of governing diversity, multicultural societies and faith,
Yes.
with the intent of, I guess, building a more tolerable type of society to deal with these issues in view.
In your research, was there a distinction between secular laws versus religious-based laws in terms of promoting?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So you're asking me, if we had two models, for example, one model relied much more on secular laws and one model relied much more on religious-based laws, did that have an impact on governing diversity? I don't know if I put it quite like that. So you had, for example, cases where they were quote-unquote secular-based laws, okay, and certain types of diversity were upheld and others were not. So they could be deeply authoritarian, for example, but quote-unquote secular-based. At the same time, on those quote-unquote secular-based societies, there's a bit of a myth, frankly speaking, that there are many places in the world that consider themselves to be quote-unquote secular, that don't really have religion involved in the public arena. This is bad. The UK, by the way, is a religious country. Legally speaking, the head of state, King Charles, is I'm going to get used to calling him King Charles. King Charles is the head of the church, and he's also head of state. Okay? And we have bishops in the House of Lords. They play a legislative role. Okay? But if I talk to people outside of the UK, they're like, yeah, of course the UK is a secular country. And certainly based on polling figures, believers in Christianity are actually less than the majority now, according to the recent polls. But legally speaking, we are not a secular country. Okay, while we are a secular country, it's sort of soft secularism, as my colleague Tarek would say. And then in some cases, there'll be this impression that no, these guys aren't the religious quote-unquote option in that particular state. It's like, okay, they may not be members of a political party that pushes religion as the defining principle of politics, but you can't call them quote-unquote anti-religion when they're talking about religion all the time. They are identifiably religious, okay, in terms of practice, that they are openly attached to their religion, like, when it's Eid, there are pictures of them, doing Eid prayers that, I remember this really clearly once. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Arab nationalism, but in 2012 we had a presidential election in Egypt, and the third place in the first round was a man called Hamdin Sabahi. Okay, Hamdin Sabahi is an Arab Nasserite. Okay, Arab nationalist, he's a Nasserite. He came in third, very close third actually. Now, Arab nationalism is Arab nationalism. I mean, this is a secular, quote-unquote, philosophy, isn't it? When he lost, first thing he did was set up a Mongol. Arab. Okay. When you might even start speeches by, it's very wrong, okay, because these guys aren't like, they left Islam because they believe in, a political philosophy that I think is strange, but, something Muslim. Okay, so, there weren't any neat, clear-cut divisions in that regard, because you'll often find that systems present a certain face, or on paper look a certain way, but in practice could be very, very different. I know other places like that. I mean, there are some places in the Gulf where people say, oh, this is a very secular country, it's very open, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying that you're wrong, probably wrong, but that's not my issue. When you look at the laws, no, these are deeply religious systems. They're deeply institutionalized as such. Okay? Whereas you can go to a place like Turkey, where the legal system is actually incredibly secular, okay, forcefully so, done as a result of a very, difficult time in Turkish history, but the ruling party is actually quite religious, right? So it's not as clear, okay? When you go to a place like Tunisia, from let's say 2013 to up until like a couple of years ago, there's a constitution that is ostensibly a very secular constitution, and was deeply supported by consensus by the entirety of society, including its most religiously based party, the Nakhta. Okay, so it's not always so easy to just like put things into these boxes. I'm sorry if that wasn't the clear-cut answer you're looking for. I would like there to have been the possibility for one, but it's just very complicated. The models. So the academic from UN, I've lost you now, but you're somewhere on this side, I remember that. The models, if you go to, well, you'll have to Google this, but if you Google Greece, GREASE and EUI, European University Institute, you'll find the webpage, and inshallah you'll be able to find all the models I explained there. And the other, is that okay? Was that you?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, good. All right. And the second, evolving look at minority within the UK. The Muslim community, so we are talking about the Muslim community in this regard. The Muslim community in the UK is actually quite small. So it's sometimes difficult to see how things have evolved. Where things have evolved, I think, is you can clearly identify that certain types of rhetoric in the public arena have become tolerated when, 5-10 years ago, they never would have tolerated. Now, I will say that the UK is a particularly awkward type of case because, as you realize, we left the European Union recently. This was the result of, frankly, discourses that are incredibly problematic and toxic, and is the mainstreaming of, in my opinion, that sort of far-right imperative. And going along with that, wrapped up in that, is of course negative views about minority groups, Muslims, foreigners, people who are not white, migrants, refugees, etc. Okay, so that's very clear. All right, so things have evolved. I won't say they've evolved in the best of ways at all. Having said that, if I'm comparing the UK to a lot of Europe, then certainly the UK is in a better place when it comes to minorities than a lot of parts of Europe. And I don't want to claim, and I wouldn't claim that the rest of Europe is, suddenly some sort of, graveyard for minorities. I think that's silly. I think that's very wrong. and I also think that it's sensationalizing issues that are just not very useful. People go to Europe as minorities for a reason. Okay, so just to keep that in perspective, but certainly, and I hope I'm not being nationalistic on this point, I do think the UK is actually a much more comfortable place for minorities as compared to a lot of other European countries. Just to put that into context, but it's certainly not as good as it ought to be. But you also have the Mayor of London is Muslim. Okay, you have significant figures in society that are Muslim. So I'm going to ask a rhetorical question here, and I don't want you to answer it for me. Okay. Does anybody think that there's no sexism in Malaysia? Nobody answer, please. Now, as you think about the answer to that question, but we have, this professor who's a woman. So obviously there's no sexism in Malaysia. Well, that's not true, is it? It just means that there are different types of challenges. Okay, so we have those prominent figures in society that are indeed Muslim. Doesn't mean Islamophobia disappeared because that happened. And so the challenges are different, but that doesn't mean that they've evaporated. I hope that addresses your question.
We have to take a pause there in terms of taking questions from the audience. I just want to ask you very sincerely, is the aircon bothering you again? Because I'm so sorry to the person in charge. Can you not lower it down? That was a request. We can't. That's right. The aircon AI is not part of it. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So if anyone is in dire straits, it will be the aircon is put in inside, we will switch it on again. Okay, thank you so much.
Just put your scarf on. No.
We forgot to ask you to bring blankets. Okay, if you will allow us to proceed, Chair, a couple more questions from ourselves. You want to take some more? Can we stick to the formats, because it's around 2 so more, yeah? Then we will open the floor again. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Chair, with reference to the recent events, picking up from what Dr. was saying throughout the day just now, recent events in Sweden and the Netherlands, do you think that the hostility is actually towards Muslims as a minority group, per se? Or is the hostility linked to the inability to agree with what Islam or the Quran actually teaches? And related to that, in the context of Islamophobia, for example, what are some of the complaints about the minority coming from the majority? Is the Muslim population minority, are they doing their best to be assimilated, to understand the majority, be with the majority? Sorry if the question sounds simplistic, because I think it's very easy to blame the other, as you said. We don't look at ourselves enough, I think. As Muslims, are we doing the maximum? We do mind us that nexus. I've got 2 questions for you then. Yeah, sure, no problem. Okay, we started at 10:21. We started at is there anything? It's just not stick to ours. Okay, I'm trying to okay. So we got a question from Dr.
Assalamualaikum. I'm here from here. I don't know if this is a sensitive question or not, but I'd like to hear your comments on how from the Western perspective, from the the mainstream groups in the Western countries, on how, for example, India and China are governing the diversity and multicultural societies and faith in the countries.
Can I ask you for clarification on that? So when you say the mainstream groups, are you just talking about Western society in general, or are you talking about Muslims?
More of general. So that's, because those are the people who impact the rest of how globally, how such methods of governing.
So that's a good question. Now I work primarily in two capitals in the West. One is Washington DC, which is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We do a lot on both of those countries, China and India. And from a policy perspective, this isn't about Islam. And the other is London, where I work with the Services Institute, which is the oldest, it's actually the oldest think tank in the world, but it focuses on security. So I engage quite heavily with policymakers when it comes to these sorts of issues in those capitals, and every so often in Brussels with the European Union. Now, I mentioned that so that you can understand where I'm coming from in terms of what I'm about to tell you. Nobody's happy with China and minorities. Nobody's happy with China and minorities because of the Uyghur question in particular. Now, I will tell you, nobody seems to be wanting to do much about it either. Okay? But nobody is sort of holding up China as a good example of how to manage diversity. On the contrary, it's increasingly a pariah issue. When it comes to India, it's probably a bit more mixed because I don't think that people quite understand how that works. India is a much more open society, so there's conflict that is open on the issue of minorities, at least more so than what you would have in China. So I think that the discussions around India are more complicated in that regard, where you do find a lot of people very concerned about how the ruling party in India is engaging with Muslim minorities, and people are very happy. But there's also a lot of pushback from different parts of Indian society that people can see. I'm not saying these are equal sides. I'm just saying that it's more evident, and because it's more evident, I think that impacts on the discussion that you will have in those categories. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, is it about the Quran or the Muslims? They'll say it's about the Quran, it's about Muslims. Okay, but they'll try to talk about it as though it's about religion, because racism is a really bad word in the West. Okay? So you'll find very often that people will be, so this guy in particular, for example, he's a lawyer. So he knows exactly what he can get away with in terms of what he can say. So he can say what he likes about religion. He can curse religion, he can swear religious symbols, he can burn the Quran, he can do all of that. Okay, sorry for your expression. Whereas if he says something about Muslims, then he's going to get, as they say, completely sent up the river. Okay, because then it will be about a community and he'll be taken down from racism. Okay, and he knows it. He knows it. So he's very, very careful about what he will say and what he won't say. But of course, we all know you're talking about Muslims. All right, you know that you can't say this about them as a community. So you're saying it about their religious figures. You're saying it about their religion, and you're doing it in their areas to say, no, I love Muslims. I just hate Islam. There are loads of people like this. It's like, I love Muslims. They're my fellow human beings. I love Muslims. I have nothing against Muslims, but I hate Islam. And I'm allowed because it's a religion, and I'm allowed to do that. Okay, and this is the trick. This is the trick that I think a lot of people use. So I wouldn't really buy when they try to make it about, nothing about Muslims, it's all about Islam. It's like, well, that's ridiculous. If you're constantly raising the temperature about Islam, where's that going to go? You know very well where it's going to go. Is the Muslim minority at fault? I really mixed feelings about this question. What they're doing, I really have mixed feelings about that question too. So, okay, so. Okay. You know my so. If my daughter is not doing very well at school, I'm going to be cross. And I'm going to take her to one side at home with my mom and have a good talk to her about her at home. If someone dared say one word about my daughter in public, they won't go down very well. Even if it's exactly the same thing. So I think that there's an important space in community settings where we remind our own community that look, you could do a lot better, you know you should do a lot better, start with that. Okay? Because that's what is required of you by your own principles. It's their failure to do so why they're having a bad time. I'd never say that. And I think it's frankly, quote unquote, blaming the victim. Okay? Because they're not being attacked or criticized because of that. Okay? They're being attacked or criticized because some people just gonna hate. Now, would they hate if that community was perfect? Okay. Well, maybe they would, but that's not why they're being attacked. So do I have critiques of the British Muslim community? I have loads of critiques about the British Muslim. But I don't think that's really why they're being attacked. And I think it's important to be clear about that. Externally as well, and keeping in mind, when we talk about, we also have to be careful with language, right? So most Muslim communities that I know in the West are integrated according to any objective standard of quote-unquote integration. If you came up with a list of points, then they're already there. Does that mean that for me, as a member of that community, does that mean for me that they're doing everything that they ought to be doing, not according to this list, but more than that? No. Okay, of course not. There's lots of stuff, but I don't think that that's why they're having problems. I remember going to the United States in 2005 as a guest, because this was right after the 7th of July bombings in the UK, and we were invited. So the British government actually arranged for a delegation to visit the U.S. and engage American Muslim communities and so on. And I was on that. Now, I remember meeting one American Muslim leader. He said, "What's wrong with all the European Muslims? Y'all ain't integrated. Okay, but we're integrated. We're fine. That's why we don't have any Islamophobia." He's like, "But you guys are in so much trouble. We have no idea what's going on. Just give it time." And actually, Islamophobia in the US, in some ways, is much worse now. At the time, it wasn't. Okay? But it was a very different environment. Okay? And they're not any less integrated now than they were 15 years ago. If anything, on the contrary, right? But they face all this stuff, so it's got really very little to do with that per se. But even so, I would still advocate for certain changes or reforms or so on and so forth, because I think that's what they ought to do. But that's from an internal community perspective, and particularly as somebody who engages in the religious arena, I think that's appropriate to interview on that ethical level. But that's not why this is unfolding.
Question about intra-faith dialogue. with that. In fact, if you want, we open the more questions for, please.
Thank you. My name is Satina. I'm formerly from MU, but I've been the Minister of Education and Higher Education and now with Malaysian Institution for Education. I have this question that normally is in my mind very much. We talk about a religious leader just now, and we also talk about national leader, like in our country. The Prime Minister is a national leader, but we also have religious leaders. There are many of them. I'm just, as you read the Quran, and I don't speak Arabic, I know very little, I'm trying to learn, but you read interpretation of the Quran, you read many times of the Quran, and as a leader of the country, one is required to follow the Quran as a leader. But of course, in a country like ours, when we talk about governing diversity, multicultural societies and faith, there are a lot of differences. So where is the line actually for a leader to really take as a national leader or as a religious leader? Because there are certain things that I notice that is not done in my country. I'm sorry, I have to ask you this because it is bugging me so much, and yet our religious leaders are so not talking anything when there are certain things done in our country. So how do they place this? Because they said as a national leader we have to play a different role, but as a religious leader you have to play a different role. So where do we stand? I'm sorry, I have to ask the question because I'm confused myself. Thank you, Prof. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
I've been wondering if we have not been educating our young to know more about other religions. It's almost as if the policy is not to expose Muslims to other religions, as if there is a fear that their faith may be perverted. What is your opinion on that?
Yes, sir. Sorry.
Thank you. On your topic, governing diversity, everything, no affiliation to any organization, just a citizen of Malaysia. And from your topic, governing diversity, it's implicit that you are giving the role and responsibility to the state or government to manage multiracial or faith-related issues in any particular country. And you have alluded just now to the different models that could be problematic and could be the source of the problem as well, of not being able to manage multiracial society and faith system. I don't know what's next. We can't find a good combination of civil society driven or state driven. Like in Malaysia, there's so many institutions and so many public policies which are good, but when not well implemented, and when politicians talk. And I want to bring this race on the social media, the role, responsible journalism and social media. There's a lot of extreme views being put in the social media. And even recently in India, they banned the film on Modi. So I think some of the hotspots and problems could be created by this social media. This is owned by the state, by individuals or even the public. Google tried to extreme views by controlling so that there is no such, and a lot of the ISIS members join ISIS through social media when they study about their dissatisfaction in their own country. So what do we see about the balance between the freedom of speech and expression, and also the role of the social media in handling these issues on diversity and multicultural? Thank you.
So, the first question when it comes to religious leaders and political leaders and Quran and so forth. So, I sense you have a lot that you're thinking about, the particular policies you're thinking about, and you must be a diplomat in some way because you're being very careful about what you said. But let's be clear about something. Your country voted for somebody, and as far as I know, he is a believer. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Okay, none of us are. Islam belongs to the Prophet I'm not going to speak on behalf of people's abilities to actually put certain things into practice. And at least from my perspective, I try to hold people to account on the basis of what they said they do. Again, I'm not talking about your Prime Minister about arguing, just talking in general when it comes to political leaders. If they make certain promises, and we open to account on those particular promises, because that's the mandate that they were given, right? Religious leaders have a different mandate. They're not political leaders. They're religious leaders. And they should be less concerned about quote-unquote what is popular or what is beneficial for their popularity, and more about what is in the public benefit, what is true and virtuous in accordance with what they know and what they believe. These are different roles and different functions, they really are. And this is what, it was mentioned, one of my teachers, Sheikh Saraj, he had very pronounced political views. And probably a handful of people knew what political views actually were, because he wouldn't go on the minbar and talk about that. Now, if you listen really carefully, you could probably figure it out if there's a crisis going on. But otherwise, he didn't do that. He didn't do that because he wanted the place that he preached in to be a place where everybody would feel welcome. And certainly many people who were there were incredibly political. They were anti-apartheid activists, because you're South African. There were people in this political party, this political party, and so on. And everybody knew that they were. They didn't hide it. But they also didn't start like waving flags in the mosque or something. That wasn't their thing. It was inappropriate. I'll tell you, there were some political leaders that really did get involved in political matters. One famous one was Imam Hellyer. He was a deeply committed religious leader who was viciously against the government. And he was killed. So we consider him shaheed. But I think that such a political issue as apartheid is not a partisan, this is really in the realm of public benefit, considering, what's going on. Of course, then it's a judgment call. It's like, well, I think this is in the realm of public benefit. Well, is it really, or is it about your political group? And that's a judgment call. And people have to be honest with themselves about that. I'm sure lots of politicians think that I got into politics to help everybody. And somewhere down the line, maybe something changes. They don't necessarily know. Nobody's going to say, no, I got involved in politics because it only going to help me and my chance. Nobody goes in like that, really. It's very few people who are quite so vicious. But they can end up in that sort of way. So I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer for you. But I hope and pray for the best for Malaysia. I've always been very fond of into account. So, educating the young about other faiths and being imperiled, or fearing they're being imperiled about their faith if they know about other faiths. So I don't know enough about Malaysia in that regard. It seems this is a concern that you have. So I'm sure there must be something to it, but I don't know. I don't think that there's really any issue for people who are in a deeply multi-faith society for them to know the basics about other religions, because it obviously informs their compatriots, right? I know a fair deal about Christianity. Now, of course, it's different for me because it's a minority, but I also know something of Coptic Christianity in Egypt, where I'm a majority, not a minority. And I like to know, in order to understand, a little bit about their own sort of tradition, not because I'll have like deep religious conversations or interfaith or anything like that, because these are my neighbors. I don't think, I hope my faith hasn't been threatened in some way by knowing about these things. I think I know enough about my religion to feel comfortable. And I would presume that, people, if Muslims are afraid that by knowing something about the other, their own faith will be imperiled, I think they have much bigger problems than what is apparent. Because their faith should not be so easily rattled if they're believers. I'm sure they're believers, but maybe just get confused. Yeah? Okay, you get into this, I just don't know about. And I would feel ill-equipped and frankly out of place to comment because I simply don't know.
Years back, we had this context probably where all students learn about other religions. But the dates sideline subject.
And maybe it's about time we bring it back, because that was, the one was a very safe way of exposing everyone else's basic beliefs, if you like, or basic worldview, and not threatening. So many of us were part of that teaching, involved teaching of the subject. And why we call our Center for Civilization and Dialogue, not religious dialogue. So there's also a reason for that. So thank you, Dato, and so Shane. Yes. That's right.
So just I won't say clarification, that's not fair, but when we talk about valuing diversity, it's not always about the states. Actually, I have negative views of the state, if I'm frank, because I think that we put a great deal of emphasis on the state and give it more power than it ought to have, which makes the rest of us frankly lazy, but also the state, the modern nation state is built to fall away at civil society. Healthy communities have healthy civil society. State is their particular sort of quote-unquote macro questions. So for example, you can't say civil society is going to defend against the nation. Okay? The state or the governing authority, so-called, has to exist in order to take care of certain necessities. Beyond those necessities, I would prefer they stay out of our business. Okay? Just historically speaking, you didn't have strong states in this part of the world. Okay? The communities were fine. In fact, they were very healthy. If you went to places like Muslim Iberia and Muslim Spain or Portugal, there was street lighting and running water, none of that was provided by the state. Not on solar power, it was provided by the civil society. State, when I think of state, I think of regimes like Bashar al-Assad in Syria. That to me is the logical conclusion of state. And it's not pretty. So, on the contrary, I think civil society needs to be much more involved. And the state should allow for that to happen, allow that to happen, and facilitate that to happen, as opposed to taking it away. I take your point very well about social media. I think social media actually is a double-edged sword as being too fair, honestly. But I think social media is actually incredibly problematic. I think it's had a very negative impact on our young and this current generation, particularly, frankly, men, if I'm honest. And when it comes to extremism and radicalization, it's been really quite awful. And, social media has developed very, very, very quickly, and we haven't really caught up with it. So this has come up a few times actually since I've been here, and I mentioned this in one of my talks recently. Those of us who have children know that when we send our children to schools, we always, engage with them about, so how are things at school? Okay, oh, you bullied, this is what happens, well, this is how you should behave, but we teach them adab. They put things in the right place. So we're sending them to school, so we're not going to be there, right? So because we're not going to be there, we train them, or we talk to them about, how that goes on. We don't do that on social media at all. We don't do that on social media. We just have them the phone, or the laptop, or the iPad, and the schools don't help. Because they also encourage, like, let's go on social media, engage like that. These are suspects. They can be very useful for things too, but they're also really ugly. And people ought to be prepared and know that just because there's a screen between you and what you're writing, you should still behave. You should still be. I've met people who in person are very nice and online are horrible. Their inhibitions are just out the window, and it's what we call in Arabic a traditional sort of thought. The animal soul runs rabid, absolutely rabid. And especially with their lungs, whereas in person, they'll be very deep and humble and polite, because then there's a price to pay, right? So I take your point. I hope that's what the rest is too.
Last question. Myself, and then we're free to finish the session. Your opinion, okay, because you've had so many experiences, you've shared some of them versus now vis-a-vis policies. Yeah? So what types of strategies should actual policies have actually proven to be successful or relatively more successful in the governing of cultural diversity, and especially so in the context of faith? What is faith coming to? Does it boil down to the person who is involved in policy? Like, I just mentioned the word adab. That comes from your faith system, right? So, presumably, if policymakers are true to their faith or to their belief system or their values, then they will be coming up with more effective policies. What do you think?
I think that when you talk about diversity, it's very important for us to empathize with those that we're not like. Now, empathy doesn't mean agreement. I mean, you can also empathize and severely disagree. Okay, so you guys just came out of lockdown, and during COVID, I know you guys did pretty well in terms of vaccination rates. What was it, 80-85%? then we'll have to go 50%, right? Okay. So, actually that's a very good example. Why did the other 15-20% get vaccinated? Now, I personally don't think this is a subjective issue. I think it's an objective one. But I need to understand why they disagree. I don't think it's subjective, so I think they're wrong. I don't think, oh, they have different points of view. No, I think they're wrong. But I still need to understand why they think that, don't I? And I can only do that by engaging with them. And I think the same applies when we're talking about engaging with the other on many other issues as well. Okay, so I might think that, you know, community X actually has it really good and they're very comfortable and actually they shouldn't be complaining about anything at all. And then I speak to them and I engage with them and it's actually apparent that, cool, actually they have these complaints and maybe I agree with some of them, maybe I don't agree with others, maybe I don't know about these and maybe I do know about these and I think, oh sorry, that's just the way it's going to be, but I need to have that sense of openness and empathy in order to engage. Again, engagement doesn't mean we're going to agree. It means that we find a way to discuss that then hopefully, inshallah, holds back the opportunity for tension to erupt into something much worse. And I would argue that's an ethical imperative. So you're talking about people connected to their faith and so on. I would hope that that's an ethical imperative that they hold a strong commitment to as a result of that. You know, sometimes people don't. Sometimes religion becomes the underpinnings of what we call identity politics, and that's a different sort of imperative altogether. It really comes down, in my opinion, to being open to engage and discuss. Again, I'm not talking about agreement. Okay? I don't agree with the far right. Okay? I don't agree, and I don't think that they have another point of view. I think that's nonsense. But I do need to understand why they think like that, to see, okay, what can I do to make them less vulnerable to believing this stuff? Okay? What is there on a policy level that can be changed to make it more difficult for recruiters to get that? Okay? I mean, you have that with extremism here too, right? So extremist groups, non-Muslims, okay, they target particular types of people, don't they? And if we don't understand how those people are vulnerable, we obviously think that this is wrong. Okay? We don't think that they're correct, but we need to understand why they're vulnerable, what's going on there, so that we can try to give them, better resiliency and so on, so that they can't be targeted, or if they're targeted, that they're immune to the recruitment strategy. So for me, that type of openness to engage is deeply important. And of course that takes for granted that you're very clear about what you are, about your tradition. This was something I learned from my own teachers, that we were very, very open to engaging with other worldviews and other civilizations and so on, but they knew exactly what they were about. And they held to it, and they held to it clearly for their entire lives. There was never any question of compromising with it. But because of that, they were very comfortable and open about engaging with others. So I hope that addresses this.
How I wish the directive you just shared with us is something that is, for lack of a better word, something that can be institutionalized. I mean, how many people speak like this, especially in the context of intra-faith differences?
So on a policy level, you have, at least in the UK, you have these opportunities for stakeholders to engage with institutions that engage, that do actually do policy, right? And if you don't have the right people in those institutions that can, extend the hand and try to talk, very often, I won't be mean about policymakers, but they usually want very quick, short, sort of answers, and community relations is important. always so simple. So it's like, I want one community organization to deal with so that I can understand everything. It's like, well, actually, they don't exist like that. You know, there's like 5. So you're going to have to go talk to 5. I don't have time. It's like, that's your job. Okay? And to institutionalize that regular engagement. Okay? But again, very often politics comes into it. It's like, no, we're not engaging with that group because we don't like what they said about our other policies. It's like, that's society. Sometimes we agree on something, so we disagree. So if you widen out the circle of those that you engage with, those that you talk to, those that, again, it doesn't mean your policy will change. It doesn't have to change. What has to change is what you're taking into account. And you might take into account, okay, take this into account, I'm sorry, that's whack. You know, I don't agree with this is nonsense, but I know that they think like that, so I need to consider, okay, how's that going to impact on other things? You can't do any of that if you don't have that wide sort of stakeholder kind of approach. That's my opinion.
That's for the center activities for City Masa Depan, I think, to consider, and I think that's what its approach is, isn't it? Provide a space, and that's what we're all here. And I know in the audience there are very important issues also. So I know we can't say enough in terms of the appreciation of your being here. And I hope that we can have takeaway messages from this session, and I hope we can continue having this session. Yeah, we still have 10 minutes. Any more questions? Yeah, last one. After this question, Shay will give us something, words of wisdom perhaps.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator and guest speaker. I'm Rahima Abdul Kadir. I'm a member of the Association of ex-UM Professors. We have an association, yeah. So I would keep to that because I'm a retiree of 20 years. Yeah, so I'm still with UM. And I'm a very naive person. Yeah, I'm a dentist by profession. So I'm trying to understand everything here. But at one stage in my life in UN, I was heading this unit of whereby the Ministry of Higher Education had imposed as a compulsory subject to make our students in the public universities become a civilized and understood generation. So we have come up with this civilization courses and ethnic courses. I thought that, and I was heading there. I don't teach, yeah, but I try to understand whatever was there. Yeah, but to my mind, and it has been 30 years, and the last 10 years, they have even imposed it on the private universities, because I was in the private universities in the last 10 years. And to my mind, if the cost and the policy that goes with it is successful, don't you think we would not be in a mess today with our young generation now moving towards what you said just now, open-mindedness, understanding each other, mutual respect. So what do you think? Are we moving in the right direction for this is moving forward? We're moving forward. I'm looking more, I'm not interested in all this, I'm interested more to see my young chuchu, grandchildren, all moving forward to that kind of society that we are talking about today. What is your comment? Thank you very much.
First one comment is you have more children. I have very little to say. And I have very little to say because, as I said, I've been away for quite some time. So I can't tell you if you're moving in the right direction or not. I hope you are. And as I said, this country is very new to me. So I hope and I pray that you are moving in the right direction. And may God protect this land from all enemies, enmity, and advocate. And I hope to be back again soon, maybe spend longer time, and then maybe I will be able to formulate an informed answer to your question. But apologize, I'm not trying to run away from your question, but I know I not give an answer, they get the wrong one, which is sometimes very rare in our profession, so I hope you appreciate that. And thank you for the question, and thank all of you for having spent time with that. I know we were over late, you know, I think we were supposed to be 10 to 12, and then we're past that time, so I appreciate that all of you were to stay for quite so long. And thank the moderator, Professor Zidane, for excellent moderation, to Azri for inviting me and hosting me, and really to all of you for a very stimulating session, to excellent questions, especially to those of you who asked questions, and I hope that I answered them effectively. And I hope everyone again for his show. So,